So, hi, my name is Vida Johnson, and I'm an associate professor of law at Georgetown Law School. Before I was a professor at Georgetown, I was a public defender here in Washington, D.C. for a number of years.
Excellent. That's great work. So today we're going to be talking about two articles you wrote a couple years ago now. One is called "The KKK and the PD: White Supremacist Police and What to Do About It." And then the one that you wrote before that, which I found equally as compelling, is "Bias in Blue: Instructing Jurors to Consider the Testimony of Police Officer Witnesses with Caution." So I think if we start with that one, I think that would be a good kind of precursor into the discussion of the more hate group infiltration. So you could kind of give us an overview of what you were trying to do in Bias in Blue, and what you found in Testimony of Police.
Sure. So let me first start by saying that I believe that most police officers get into policing for all the right reasons, including members of my own family. I have an uncle who's a DEA agent. I have members of my family on both sides that were police officers. And even my husband was a police officer for a short period of time before he went to law school. So I don't want anything I say to be construed as applying to all police officers. But unfortunately, I do think that there's a very serious problem in policing that's probably existed for a long time, but I think has gotten even more heightened recently. I think there is a view that's prevalent among some police officers that they are at war with the communities that they are supposed to be protecting and serving. And so police officers, I think, unfortunately, sometimes, and only some of them, sort of have this us versus them mentality, as opposed to kind of seeing themselves as members of a community that they're there to serve and protect. What I was trying to do in the Bias in Blue article was to sort of point out a lot of the biases that police officers have in their work, but particularly when they testify as government witnesses. So having been a public defender for so long, I'd seen so many officers super invested in their cases. And I think that's sort of what we expect from police officers, that they care about the cases that they bring. But when we instruct jurors and tell them what to make of testimony, we give them legal guidance. And this is called jury instructions. And the jury instructions that we give for police officers tell jurors, as a matter of law, that they must consider the testimony of a police officer no different than anyone else and not give it any greater weight or any lesser weight simply because they're police officers. Okay, so that kind of seems fair, right? Like we're not going to give them any more weight, we're not going to give them any less weight. But when you think about what police officers actually do and how invested they are in their cases, it's actually not fair to tell jurors that a police officer is the same as an innocent bystander, an unbiased witness, someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight, when in fact, many officers in many instances do. Now, there's certainly cases where police officers may not have much of a stake. Let's say it's an armed robbery case, and the only thing that the police officer did was, find the gun. That officer might not necessarily have much of a stake in the outcome of the case. He may not care whether this particular defendant gets prosecuted or not. He may not even have an idea whether this accused person is the perpetrator. But if we think about what police officers do generally, which is sit around and look for crimes that they believe to be taking place. So stopping someone on the highway, stopping and frisking someone on the street, doing undercover buys and busts, those kinds of things, police officers have a very significant interest in the outcome of their case, because the entire case, the credibility of the government's entire case, the prosecutor's entire case, will rest on the word of the police officers. And so in those instances, the police officers not only have their own reputational interests in the outcome of the case, but they may have a lot of other interests in the outcome of the case. So particularly when you're talking about crime that is sort of sought out by police as opposed to like a call from service, those officers are kind of in some ways creating the crime, right? They're going out, standing in a corner and says, does anyone know where I can get some cocaine? That officer's credibility is the whole case. And because the police department is devoting resources into sending that guy out, paying his salary, paying his overtime, that's all going to be something that he's thinking about in the back of his head when he testifies. And then when you start thinking about these encounters that are non-consensual, where a police officer is stopping someone and their word about whether the stop was legal, that's where you're going to really see a big question about the police officer's credibility and any biases that he may have. And unfortunately, I do think that we as a general society in our criminal legal system underestimate the amount of bias. And so in the article, I point out a lot of instances where police officers are caught lying under oath or planting evidence or assaulting someone. And we now are seeing that given the proliferation of body-worn cameras, cell phone cameras, and dash cameras. So that was a very long-winded answer to your first question, but that was really what I was attempting to get at in the article.
The thing that I was struck by in the article is that you really do tie together the prosecution and the judiciary as kind of all three, they're kind of three legs of the same stool. And maybe if you could talk about kind of how the prosecution, police, and judges are charged not only with kind of policing themselves, but then also building a case. So
yeah, that's a great question. So I think that the easiest relationship to really talk about is the one between police officers and prosecutors. Prosecutors can't make their case without police officers. They rely on police officers of some sort in every single case that they bring, right? Because the lawyer himself or herself can't be the witness. So they rely on the witnesses to help make their case. And so in a lot of instances, those are police officers. And whether it's a crime where someone calls the police and the police respond, or whether it's one of those crimes that we talked about earlier, where a police officer is going out and looking for that crime, looking for someone with guns, looking for someone selling drugs, those officers are going to be the government's entire case. And so prosecutors, particularly vice prosecutors, the ones that are prosecuting guns and drugs and other illegal activity like sex work, for example, they have a very close relationship with police officers, and they need police officers. And so there's an extreme bias in favor for law enforcement amongst those police officers. Among those prosecutors, yet those prosecutors are also supposed to be the ones who are deciding whether these police officers are telling the truth, whether they have enough evidence, whether their word is good enough. And often, they're weighing that against maybe what a witness is saying, or the accused person who's saying, no, I didn't do it. That didn't belong to me. It was someone else, or, I was just in that car. It didn't, I wasn't the driver, whatever it is. The prosecutors, because they deal with those police officers, the same police officers every day, don't want to step on the toes of the police officers that they rely on day in and day out to make their cases. And then when you think about the personal relationships that they create over time. Someone who has been a prosecutor for a long time is likely to also have friends and significant others that are police officers in that same department that they work in, because of the amount of time they spend with those police officers. And obviously they're not going to be able to call as a witness, their spouse police officer, but they could certainly call a pal of their spouse police officer as a witness, and nobody would blink an eye. And that happens every day in a lot of places around the country. And so there's two types of very serious bias that we see amongst prosecutors towards police officers, because they have this professional bias of needing them for their own careers to succeed, but also these personal relationships, which we all have with people. We all sort of, gravitate towards those people we spend time with and know well. At some point, you get invited to the kid's bar mitzvah or the wedding, or, the retirement party of someone, where you meet all of these people. And so I think those are very significant biases that we should be thinking a lot about, particularly when we think about who should police the police, because it should not be prosecutors that have those types of relationships with police officers. As we all sort of collectively as a nation think about how should we monitor the behavior of police officers, we should be thinking about ways to get bias out of the equation to make it a fair process for everyone. And then I can talk about judges.
Yes.
Okay. So I think there's less bias there, at least I hope there is. But I do see some. So I'll use my own courthouse as an example. So my courthouse here in Washington, D.C., and our misdemeanor courthouse, the cases are divided by police district. Or precinct is what they call it in other places. So, anyone who was arrested in the 2nd district in Washington, D.C., they're going to be in the same courthouse. And everyone who is arrested in the 4th district is going to be in the same courtroom. And so the judge who presides over, let's say, the 4th district, he's going to see the same officers day in and day out. And this isn't a big city, right? This is the nation's capital. But even there, we have made it so that there is going to be this relationship between the police officer and the judge. Now, is it a close one? Not necessarily, no. But is it going to be hard for that judge to find that a police officer isn't telling the truth, to weigh his testimony just like the stranger he's never seen before, when he's seen that police officer, arrive on time in his uniform day in and day out? I think that makes it tough for a judge to follow the law the way he should. I think it's very difficult for judges to find that a police officer is purposely lying, because it makes it so hard for him to have to see that officer the next day. That's awkward, right? But B, he knows that that is really going to make it difficult for the prosecutors to bring their next cases with that same officer if there's an adverse credibility finding made against that police officer. So it's a real disincentive in a case like, in a jurisdiction like mine, where we have bench trials, for judges to find that a police officer isn't telling the truth. But yet we know that police officers don't tell the truth. They're at times, we know that they're human beings like anyone else. And sometimes they're going to fib. Sometimes they're going to say they don't remember things that they remember. And so, this makes for a system that isn't fair. And so this is a big city. Imagine a small town where there's only a handful of police officers and maybe only 1 or 2 judges. It's going to make it even more difficult for a judge there to find that a police officer isn't telling the truth. And when we think about, what role judges have in police officers' future, it's actually pretty significant. If a judge finds that a police officer is willfully lying, it makes it very difficult for the police department to use that witness in future cases, right? Because he is someone who, they can't rely on to make their case anymore. So they're likely going to take that officer off of interactions with the public. Can't put him on, pulling cars over in traffic stops. You can't have him, policing a particular neighborhood where you think that there might be cases that arise out of it. So it really is going to stop the trajectory of a person's career to call them a liar. And in a way that a judge knows very well, whereas a juror might not understand that, and isn't going to have to say their findings out loud. Like a juror just says, I find someone guilty or I find them not guilty. Whereas a judge is going to give findings about why he found someone guilty or why he found someone not credible, let's say at a Fourth Amendment suppression hearing. And so there's just this very, there's a very big incentive for police officers to cozy up to judges and to be very friendly and their most professional around them. So we often, as defense attorneys, see police officers come off as the most charming, delightful selves in front of the judge. And then we see them in the hallway where the judge doesn't go, acting and behaving in a very different way with members of the community. And I mean, we all put our best foot forward in front of someone important, but we know that police officers do that as well. And it has serious ramifications for the public when they do.
Well, that's interesting too, because one of the things that I didn't think about at all, and your article brought it up, was the fact that if, I forget the term for it, but if there's any misconduct or something that the police have lied about in the past, that has to be turned over to the defense. And the people who turn that over to the defense are the prosecution and the judges. So that kind of complicates the whole explanation you just gave. And I think that if you could talk a little bit more about kind of how that process is supposed to happen versus how it actually happens.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So we fortunately have a rule called the Brady Rule. It comes from a case called Brady versus Maryland that held that the government must turn over anything that's favorable to the accused. So anything that a defense attorney would want to know about to help her case, the government is supposed to turn that over to the defense in time for the defense attorney to make use of it at trial. And that information is turned over in cases they're going to trial and where the prosecutor decides that the information is material. So they don't have to necessarily turn over the information that, that police officer was late for his physical last year and he got in trouble for that. But they do have to turn over instances of police discipline, or at least they should, though many jurisdictions don't. They have to turn over, prior convictions. If the officer has a conviction for spousal battery or something, they need to turn that over. They have to turn over really anything that goes to the officer's credibility as a witness. And so an adverse credibility finding made by a judge, whether, if a police officer was disciplined for stealing from someone they arrested, things like that. That's the kind of thing that they need to turn over. It doesn't just apply to police officers. The Brady Rule applies to any government witness. The government has to turn over anything that would undermine that witness's credibility. So if they have an interest in the outcome of the case in some way that isn't obvious, the government has to turn that over. When I say the government, I mean the prosecutor. But under this Brady Rule, the prosecutor is deemed to know anything that the police officer knows. And so that's a lot of information because they're supposed to be working together, both representing the government. And so they have to turn over that stuff pre-trial. Now, many prosecutors' offices take the position that they do not have to turn that type of information over if the case is not headed for trial. So if a case is, they know, for example, they've extended a plea offer and the the defense lawyers indicated that the accused person is going to take that offer, then in most instances, prosecutors probably are not going to turn over information that they have that goes to the credibility of that police officer. So even though we'd like to think this is something that's followed to a T, there isn't currently any guidance from our Supreme Court that says that the government needs to turn it over during favorable information pre-trial. There is a case, I think it's called Ruiz, that says that impeachment information may not have to be turned over. And so most prosecutor offices don't turn that kind of information over to the defense pre-trial if the case is not going to not go to trial.
Yeah, so a bad officer may never become exposed if all his cases are pled out. Is that?
Yeah. That's totally right. And, not only is he not going to be exposed to the defense bar, but often, the prosecutor himself doesn't really know about it, because the prosecutors, in this high volume world that we live in, where prosecutors bring so many cases per year, they're not going to be looking into the records of each officer, especially in a big city like DC or LA or Chicago or Philly. They're just not going to have the time to go into the disciplinary records of each officer of every case that they're, pleading out. Like if you think about New York City, for example, they make plea offers at arraignment. So the day that the person's getting charged, they're also very likely to receive a plea offer. And so there's nobody has any time to do any investigation, prosecutors and defense attorneys alike.
Well, and I think that leads nicely into our next topic, which is the hate groups and the white supremacists within the police department, which this is something I followed for many years, but this article really knocks it out of the park as far as pulling together a lot of the evidence that it's a pretty widespread problem. So maybe if you kind of talk about this, and because again, prosecutors are the ones who are supposed to deal with this, I guess, ultimately, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Right.
So this is an issue that's been something that, I initially didn't think much about. I had an idea of what hate groups were, and they were, things in my mind were from the, very distant past and didn't really impact me or my life or the world I lived in now. Well, it turned out that 2016, 2017 really made us all realize that wasn't true. The events of Charlottesville, I think, opened up a lot of eyes. But it just so happened that just before Charlottesville, there was a story that went around our courthouse. So there was a police officer who wore a T-shirt to court that had an angel of death in the middle, holding a police badge in one hand and a assault rifle in another. And there was a question about whether one of the icons in that T-shirt was connected to white supremacy. So there was that story that was happening. There was also around the same time a couple of stories in the news about big city police departments. I think one was San Francisco and another was Miami, about scandals there where police officers were texting each other and using really disparaging language. I mean, words like the N-word and other really offensive language to describe minority groups in those cities. And that was something that really astonished me because I went to college at Berkeley. I spent a lot of time in the Bay Area. I think of Miami as a very diverse, vibrant area. And so I started thinking, if this is happening in DC, San Francisco, Miami, like, how widespread is this? So I started to take a deep dive, and I found, a bunch of things. One is that there's been a long history of racism in police departments. And I think, for better or for worse, it was something that I was ignorant of until that time. And I started looking into it, that, some of our first police departments in this country were basically white men who gave themselves the power to monitor the comings and goings of enslaved people. And our police departments really grew out of that. And, we know that police officers allowed the lynchings of thousands of Black Americans in this country without anyone being prosecuted. Sometimes on the steps of the courthouse, where people took pictures of themselves committing these atrocities, and no one was prosecuted. In the 1950s, it was prevalent to have people who were part of the KKK and police departments. And this was something I hadn't learned in school or college or law school. And so when I was looking into this, I thought, wow, how did I not know any of this? And so then I started looking at more modern stories. And at that same time, we were hearing about a rise in hate crimes, just generally in the United States, right? There's a lot of Islamophobia, a lot of hatred towards Latino immigrants, just a lot of hate crimes happening in the United States. And it seemed to me that it's all connected. And right after Charlottesville, there was an ABC poll that found that 10% of Americans believed it was acceptable to hold neo-Nazi views. 10%. That was 10% of people who were willing to say that over the phone to a stranger who was polling them, right? So, small sample size, maybe it's not that high of a percentage, or at least so I told myself. But there was a not dissimilar poll right after the Capitol attack that found that I think 12% of Americans sympathized towards these the rioters. So we know that there is already a pretty significant percentage of the population that holds these far right views, these views of either white supremacy or views that you might consider totalitarian or extreme towards gay people, people of other religions. And so we know that there's a significant percentage of people who hold these views. We also know that they're more likely to be white. We also know, and male. We also know that those groups are overrepresented on police departments. We know that police officers are disproportionately white and male in this country. And so I think it's, certainly, as I said earlier, I don't want to paint all police officers with a broad brush, but I think we do ourselves a disservice as a country not to imagine and investigate whether, in fact, we have a significant percentage, maybe 10% of our police departments that hold white supremacist viewpoints. And so as I was doing that, I found, something like 178 instances of police officers saying explicitly racist things in every state, I think except one. I found a number of instances of police officers being members of hate groups like League of the South, the KKK, and a number of other groups. Since that time, we've only learned more. We know that there are police officers who have ties to the Boogaloo Boys, that have ties to the Three Percenters, the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, and these other groups and militia groups that hold far right viewpoints that aren't shared by the majority of the country. And so this is something that I think we all need to really be thinking about and spending a lot of time getting to the bottom of, because police officers wield a tremendous amount of power in our country. They have the ability to stop someone from going about their daily lives. They can pull you over, they can stop you on the street, They also have the ability to use force in ways that regular citizens can't. They even have the ability to use deadly force. We give them very serious weapons. We give them access to very sensitive information. And so the fact that there could be a significant percentage of police officers who hold these views should put a chill down everyone's spine. And we know that these police officers, the ones that I was able to document, it's just the tip of the iceberg. Any smart police officer isn't going to be posting under his actual name. The police officer shouldn't be wearing dumb t-shirts to court. So the stories that I was able to gather, and now the Plain View Project has gathered thousands of similar instances of police holding, having, hate in their hearts. We know that that's just the tip of the iceberg, that there's many thousands more police officers who probably hold those views, but because some of them are smart enough not to want to lose their jobs, and some of them are purposely infiltrating police departments to gain information on their investigative priorities, we know that there's probably many more officers who hold these views than the ones we've been able to root out.
Yeah, and that's, yeah. So I'd like to talk now about how do we weed them out. So there's some, in your article you talk about Bateson, but you also, in your conclusions, are talking about prospective officers should have to prove they are not racist before they're given a gun in a free rein. So I think, just kind of, how do we root them out, and what do we do once we find them? Yes.
I think these are great questions. And I have some ideas, but I'm sure there are lots of other people with better ideas out there too. I just would love to see a bigger conversation about what we should be doing that isn't a bunch of, academics and ivory towers coming up with ideas. I would like to see police chiefs doing something. But so the big idea I propose in my article, KKK in the PD, is that this is something that prosecutors should be tasked with because of the Brady doctrine that we talked about earlier. Prosecutors have an obligation to turn over anything that could be favorable to the defense. And so if prosecutors have to do basically a background check on police officers, and if they saw that as their role, if they realize that, look, for us to have the respect of the community and for our criminal legal system not to be something that causes so much polarization in this country, to do that, we need to really be looking into police officers. And they could do social media checks. They can turn over instances of bias. That would be one step. But that has some significant limitations because, as we talked about earlier, Brady only applies when there's a case going to trial. And so, even if prosecutors did see their role as getting to the bottom of a police officer's bias, which most do not, even if they did, they would only have to turn that kind of information over if a case was headed to trial. So there's a limitation to that proposal, but for me, it would at least be a start. And I do think that, for example, it would be a way to, once that information is turned over and once either a defense attorney gets to use it in court and becomes public, or a prosecutor, once he figures that out, hey, this guy calls Black people the N-word and makes these offensive posts, maybe I don't trust his word and dismiss the case. Either way, the police department is going to get the signal that this officer is someone we can rely on. And so either hopefully he'll be terminated, but even if he's not, he's likely to not have a public facing job. He's less likely to come into contact with the public. He's more likely to answer phones or guard evidence or do things like that and not not have as significant of a role with people in the community. So I would see that as a win. But I think there's a lot of other steps that if I was a police chief, I would expect. I think they should do better background checks of police officers. There's a horrible story about the background check that police in Little Rock, Arkansas did. There was a young police officer who applied, and he was honest in his questionnaire and said that he'd been to a KKK rally. Well, they hired him anyway. They said, well, at least he was honest, and he didn't join, he just went, and he ended up killing a young unarmed Black child. And so, and the only way we ever learned this information about what was in his questionnaire when he was being hired was because of discovery that was turned over in the civil lawsuit against that police officer in that department. So we have to actually take seriously these background checks for the reasons we talked about before. Police officers have so much power and discretion that we should be very careful about who we allow to have those jobs. We should do a much better job at recruiting women in particular, but also people of color. People of color are less likely to be white supremacists, as you might imagine, and women are less likely to use force and less likely to be members of hate groups as well. And so that's something that if I was a police chief, I would be thinking a lot about. Unfortunately, I would be thinking about the way we advertise the job of policing right now. Most police departments advertise by using pictures of their SWAT team. Well, who is that going to attract? That's going to attract someone who sees himself as at war with his community rather than someone who is a public servant, as they call it in my child's elementary school, a community helper. Like, a SWAT team and community helper, it's not the same thing. I think that police officers should have to agree to have their social media accounts monitored. And I think that an outside agency should be employed to go through police officers' text messages and emails to look for words that are associated with racial hatred, to kind of figure out who are the officers who hold these views. Oh, and body-worn camera as well. I mean, just an audit of those three things would, I think, root out a lot of really dangerous police officers. And so those are some of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of solutions, but they cost money. And a lot of people think, well, we can't afford it. Police already get so much money. But I think one way to think about this is we pay out $3 billion a year in civil lawsuits. We actually can't afford, from a financial standpoint, to have these officers on the force. And then when we think about the human costs of communities that are ripped apart by police officers that see themselves as at war with a particular community, the children of people who are incarcerated, who shouldn't be incarcerated, and the way they suffer, the trauma that people experience when they are abused and assaulted by the police, has a very significant cost that we can't put a dollar amount to.
Right. And I just learned in doing all this research about the qualified immunity that comes in usually during the civil suit, and the cities pay those out, not the police departments.
Yeah,
so that's
right.
what we're talking about with the billions of dollars that we're paying out.
Right. And so we're paying out $3 billion even in a world of qualified immunity. Right. Where, police officers, get away with doing a lot of things that I think most Americans would be surprised that the courts sanction. And so that's $3 billion when we, have all sorts of rules on what kind of behavior can someone collect under a civil rights law for. So it's a very serious cost to Americans generally, but it's particularly borne by communities of color.
Right. Yes, yeah, because those are the police officers in those communities who are doing these Fourth Amendment, shooting people and then getting sued, and then that community is paying for it. It's insidious.
Right. Or I just watched a video this morning of police officer punching someone in the face who's restrained and going into a paramedic's ambulance. Like he's completely defenseless and incapacitated, and he just gets punched in the face. I mean, that's a type of trauma, right? That person is going to experience as a result of that encounter. I don't know anything else about it, but there's so many interactions like that where no one goes to court. There's no lawsuit. There's no headline. But people have those interactions with the police that are really different than I think a lot of Americans understand. I mean, I think there's really, two types of police interactions, and they're very different.
Right. Yes, depending on where you are in the system already.
Yeah, where you are and what you look like.
That's right. That's right. And it's not very far in the past where some of these tactics, that we think of as torture today were used as police interrogations. And it was only like in the 60s. When was the Miranda? Was that
Miranda decision? Yeah, absolutely. Police would starve people, withhold medical care, and physically assault them until they confessed. Yeah, it's unfortunately, we have a long tradition of police officers being very brutal towards people they're supposed to be protecting and serving.